Hey everybody, welcome back. So I am Adam. I talk about video games, I talk about lifting weights, I talk about whatever I feel like talking about. Today I'm going to be talking about deloads in your training, lifting weights. And this is a topic that I've had on my mind recently because people have been annoying me about it, to be quite honest. So first of all, what is a deload? Well, a deload is when you're training really hard, and theoretically what is occurring is that when you train hard, you're not necessarily fully recovering from session to session, from week to week, and as a result, fatigue is accumulating over time. Because that fatigue is accumulating, it's like, okay, maybe it makes sense to take a break every once in a while. And then the idea is that taking that break means that you can basically reset that accumulated fatigue and you can start seeing better performance and continue to grow, get stronger, etc. And deloads are very, very popular. I see people asking about them a lot. I see people being like, hey, shouldn't I deload after X number of weeks? Should I deload once a month? And so on. And I disagree with that whole sentiment entirely. So to give a sense of the research is actually not really super sold on deloads being necessary. And in general, the idea is that there are really two different types of approaches you could take. You could take a proactive or a reactive approach to planning a deload. So a proactive approach to planning a deload is that you schedule it into your program consistently. So you say, okay, every 4 weeks, I take a 1 week deload or whatever the case is. You're taking those deloads regularly. Whereas a reactive approach is you're saying, hey, I had a really, really bad week. I'm going to take a deload and then hopefully things will feel better next week. It's more about like, hey, using them when you need them as opposed to just scheduling them regularly. And while the research shows that reactive deloads and proactive deloads can be useful, they also show that basically when you deload, it does basically what you'd expect, which is to say, hey, you took a week off of training, and so it's going to take you an extra week to get to the same level of strength, the same level of muscle mass than if you just continued training. So obviously there's this sort of balancing act of, okay, well, theoretically deloads are necessary periodically, but also at the same time, they are probably slowing down progress, and so you probably don't want to do them too often. And I think the deloads got really, really popular in part because they are something that kind of makes sense as dummy proofing for a mass market program. So I've talked a little bit about it previously, how there's this problem that people have, which is that they see a lot of things that are in mass market programs, and they assume that those things are good training practices and not necessarily just features of the fact that you have to make this program be very generic and work for everybody. And if a program is generic and works for everybody, that means obviously by default it's not going to work well for some people who have very specific needs. And also at the same time, there's going to have features in it that you probably don't necessarily need in many cases because it's kind of like a shotgun approach. You're trying to design something that works well for a lot of people, and if it works well for a lot of people, that's great. That makes it, successful by program standards, but it definitely means that you can't use approaches that are more niche. You can't use approaches that are really more tailored because it's just not going to work as well. And a good example is that basically any mass market program, they're probably not going to tell you to do anything that could be considered dangerous on an individual level. Maybe it's something where it's like, hey, this thing is not dangerous if you know how to do it well and if you're really experienced and you're an advanced lifter. But if you're selling this program to beginners, obviously you're not going to tell them to do that same exact approach because it's going to be more likely to get them hurt, that sort of thing. Likewise, deloads are one of those things where I don't think they're really that necessary, but they get put into mass market programs a lot because they're an easy safety valve. It's easy to say, hey, people could screw this up, people could push it too hard, people could really potentially get hurt, and you don't necessarily want your training program to have a reputation for getting people hurt or whatever the case is. So you put in deloads because deloads are going to idiot-proof the program a little bit. If you're putting in deloads regularly, it really offsets any potential risk of injury. Or at the very least attenuates it. I mean, realistically, that's not really necessarily how injury happens. Injury is more about just total training exposure than it is about particular approaches used, but I digress. And I think because a lot of these programs, or a lot of people's first experience with or exposure to lifting weights in an intelligent, concerted way, they tend to think, hey, deloads must be important. Deloads must be a thing that I focus on and that are like a crucial part of my programming, as opposed to just kind of like an extra thing that's sort of there and is maybe not doing that much depending on whether or not you actually need it. And that's, I think, really the key crucial point there, is that much in the way that like some people like programs that are more variable and some people like programs that are more stable, there's definitely a lot of like personal preference that just goes into it, right? Some people will prefer to push themselves super, super hard for a little while and then take a deload, whereas other people might like to, maybe not push themselves super, super hard, maybe, 90% hard, and then just kind of, cruise and not need a deload as often. I will say personally that obviously I do recommend deloads for my clients when it comes to a situation where it's needed. However, I do tend to take a reactive approach. I don't necessarily really plan deload specifically. I also tend to do wave-based programming in my typical program structure. So what I'll typically do is that I will start off with like a lower volume, increase to a higher volume, and then drop back down again. And so that natural wave shape creates basically harder and easier weeks within a cycle. And I think that for me, it's like, okay, well, you're basically getting a deload every 4 weeks anyway, because you're having the volume reduced a bit. So not really worth worrying about too much unless someone really specifically needs it. In my own personal training, I'm going to be so real with you. I've actually never willingly taken a deload in living memory. I have been lifting for 20 years, so maybe I've forgotten it at some point. Maybe I took deloads intentionally on some program I did when I was 16 or something. But I've genuinely, I basically never take deloads. I don't find them to be useful for me personally. I don't find that there's any kind of accumulated fatigue or anything like that. Basically, if I was not fully recovering from week to week from the work that I'm doing, then that would be too much work and I would do less. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I think also that because I'm a person who is, I've got a career, I'm reasonably active, I have travel occasionally for work or for vacation. And so if I'm going to end up traveling a few times a year anyway, and that travel is going to functionally turn into a deload where I'm taking a week off, or maybe I'm working out at a hotel and all I have is dumbbells and I don't have a lot of weight, I mean, that's basically a deload. And at that point, it's like, okay, well, if I'm going to be deloaded every couple months like clockwork anyway, what need do I have to intentionally add deloads on top of that? Probably not worth it. And in general, I personally have found that I get the best results when I don't deload. In point of fact, often what I see is that like my strength numbers are going up, things are going great, nice and smooth week to week. And then I take like a week off because I'm traveling and things drop down again, and then I have to build back up, right? Like I often find that that's really detracting from my progress more than adding to it. And that's fine. Again, it's not that I'm deloading, it's that I'm traveling, and that's having the effect of a deload. But, in general, I've just never seen the point of deloading myself. I will say that it's also a little bit different based on your goals. So in general, when you talk about training for size versus training for strength, those are two very different things. So training for size is really about getting in as much volume of training as possible to really exhaust your muscles, which helps them to grow big, versus strength, which is more about, hey, like you hit some really, really hard top sets and you call it a day. It's not as responsive to volume of training. And so it's really more about just like hitting it hard, recovering, and hitting it hard again. And so I think that while, I think there's probably less of a benefit for deloading when it comes to strength, just accordingly, whereas there can be more of a benefit for deloading when it comes to size, simply because when you're talking size, some of this training could get so exhausting or so volume heavy that after a while it might make sense, if you're just, super paralyzingly sore, that you need to take some time off and just say, hey, I'm going to take a deload here and there. At the same time, also, I think that, if you're training for a mix, power building, strength and size, probably don't need to deload as much, but, maybe occasionally. I think also it has a lot to do with how hard you're actually training. And this is another thing that I think gets lost a lot in the sauce, which is that, like, if you're the average gym goer, like, I get so many questions, I see so many things, the average gym goer being like, hey, I do need a deload every 4 weeks or my skull is going to pop out of my back or whatever. And it's like, you're not training that hard. You're really not training hard enough that you'll ever need a deload, much less, your spine will pop out if you don't have one. If you're talking somebody who's training like as a hardcore bodybuilder and they're really, really training hard, then yeah, maybe they need a deload week every month or two or whatever the case is. But realistically, a lot of people are just really not training that hard. And so that's another thing, is just beginners constantly acting like they are super hardcore experienced lifters. And it's like, yeah, man, you can barely train consistently 3 days a week. You're not training hard enough to warrant a deload regardless. So yeah, I think if you're training maybe like 4, 5, 6 days a week, you're training hard and you're training specifically for size and your volume is getting really, really high, then yeah, you probably need a deload occasionally. Everything else, the further you get away from that ideal, the less likely it is that I think that you actually need a deload. And I work for a certain app, which shall not be currently named, and that app has a workout app, which shall not currently be named. And I will say that the workout app occasionally recommends people that they take a deload. Great, wonderful for them. You have the option to select a deload if you want one. And people often write in being like, I don't understand. It's given me basically the same weights or the same intensity of workouts, but a much smaller volume. How could that be a deload? Well, that's exactly what a deload is. So that's another thing, is just people don't know what a deload is or what a deload is supposed to be. So the actual definition of what a deload is supposed to be, again, right? You are supposed to be minimizing fatigue or recovering from fatigue. But why would you still train if your goal is to recover from fatigue? Well, the answer is very simple. When you don't train at all for a week, you're going to lose a bit of strength. You're going to lose a bit of muscle mass, not much, very small amount. It accelerates the more time that you take off. So usually 1 week is not really enough to cause much of any strength and muscle loss, but you lose some, right? So if you take a week off, you lose a little bit. So the point of a deload is you still train during that week, but you are minimizing fatigue. And then that way, the idea is that because you are training that week, you can maintain your strength, you can maintain your size with, basically no drop off, while your fatigue, basically goes to zero. Well, how is it that you will train and your fatigue will still go to zero, right? That's the real question. And the answer is that you keep the intensity high, which is to say the weight is high, but you keep the volume low, which is to say to a minimum. And so what that could mean is, let's say that you are somebody who trains generally for size or for strength. That means one set of bench press, one set of overhead press, one set of some kind of, row, pull down, whatever, one set of deadlift, and one set of squat. That's it. And you need to keep the intensity high, the weight high, so that basically you are ensuring that you're preserving your strength. Because if you're not keeping the weight high, then you're not preserving your strength. So essentially you're looking at one set to, maybe not failure, maybe not, complete exhaustion, but you're doing one set at a high intensity for a challenging number of reps. And that's it. That's what you're doing. You're basically just going in, you're basically just practicing the movements and doing one set of everything while, just keeping fatigue to a minimum, because you're doing very, very little actual work. Now, you could maybe repeat this process a couple, 2, 3 times. You go into the gym, you just do 2, 3 of these very simple one set per exercise workouts. But that's it, right? So that's classically how a deload is defined. And this is very similar to what powerlifters call a peaking strategy, which is essentially that you're essentially doing a deload strategically right before a competition in order to keep strength high while lowering fatigue, so you could potentially get a little bit more out of your performance on the platform, right? That is classically how a deload is defined. That's how you're supposed to deload. And so the number of people who write in saying, oh, the intensity is high, so how is this a deload? The number of people who think that a deload means that you have to reduce the weight and just do an easy piddly workout is like, okay, well, if you're doing an easy piddly workout where the intensity is low, then you're not really getting either the effects that you're looking for. You're not really getting, you're not really maintaining strength if you're doing too low of a weight, and you're not necessarily really, doing size if you're not doing a ton of volume. So you're kind of getting the worst of both. You're really not even properly deloading. You might as well have just taken the week off at that point, I would say, personally. So that's another thing, is just people just not knowing how you're supposed to actually deload, how you're supposed to structure a deload in order to get results. And that causes a huge waste of time as well. So do you specifically need to deload? Personally, again, like I said earlier, it really has a lot to do with how you're training, how frequently you're training, how intensely you're training. And I think that a lot of people deload a lot more than is actually needed just because they think that it's needed, just because they've seen some people talk about it online, just because they've seen it in a program and they think that it's important. Even I do not deload very much, and I am a pretty hardcore lifter at this point. Of course, again, it's all going to come down a lot to personal preference, and I think that from what we've seen in the research, it's not necessarily going to be a huge difference either way, right? Like, you could deload, you could not deload, it's not going to make a huge end difference in terms of your results. And that's another thing that I think that a lot of the sort of like evidence-based, lifters nowadays really overlook, is they try and optimize everything, and they don't realize that sometimes there's a lot of things that it's just like, this didn't need to be optimized. You don't need to be perfectly optimal. The result is going to be basically the same in any case. So you're just throwing a lot of energy after something for, not much of any real result. I think that in general, deloads are not going to be a huge part of your results. What's really going to be a huge part of your results is, of course, the basics, right? It's progressive overload, hitting your major movements, getting in your protein, getting good sleep, fueling your activity, and consistently training for 5 to 10 years plus. And of course, having great genetics and maybe being willing to sip a little bit of the juice. If you've got all that in line, are deloads going to be a huge factor in your performance, in your progress? I wouldn't really say so. It's icing on the cake. It's not going to matter that much. But if you are going to deload, I would say deload intelligently and deload correctly. Keep your intensity high and limit your volume. And that's how you do a proper deload. So that is all for today's video. As always, don't hesitate to like, comment, subscribe, smash the notification bell down below. Comment down below and let me know what you'd like to see in future videos. Have a good week. I'll talk to you all next time.